In this lecture, we pick up from where we left off in our last lecture, with Luther having gone to the Diet of Worms, having been condemned as an outlaw, now by the civil government, after the excommunication earlier that year in 1521, and now Luther is kidnapped and taken by the men of Frederick the Wise to the Wartburg Castle. And we said at the end of our last lecture that Luther was not expecting, probably, to make it out of the Diet of Worms or to have made it back home. And so, with the relief of having been kidnapped and taken to the Wartburg, Luther now had essentially a year of quiet contemplation, study, and writing. Luther grew his hair out, he grew a beard, he went by the name Junker George, which is something like a low-rank noble knight. But Luther wasn't done with his Reformation. The first thing that Luther sets about to do when he gets to the Wartburg is he sets about to translate the Bible into German. Now, Luther will eventually translate the entirety of the Bible, and actually the Apocrypha as well, though he himself will doubt the Apocrypha has any place in the Scriptures. And the entirety of the Luther Bible will be published in 1534, well after the Reformation is underway. At the Wartburg, though, Luther, within the space of the year, translates the Bible into German. Now, this translation of the Bible is profoundly important not only for the Reformation, but even for the formation of the German language itself. German at this time was transitioning out of the Middle Ages, and it was beginning to take shape into something that we would call modern German, or modern High German. Well, Luther's Bible, believe it or not, is one of the formative things that shapes the transition into High German. What's interesting about Luther's translation is he knew German, but he didn't know it necessarily very well. That is to say, he wasn't a man of the people. By and large, Luther had spent most of his life conversing and speaking in Latin. Now, don't go too far with this point. It wasn't as if Latin was his first language. But since you don't spend most of your day conversing back and forth in German, and you don't spend a lot of time with the average lay speaker of German, Luther actually finds that he can be, I guess the word is creative, in his development of the German language. Still, the impulse is there in Luther to make sure that his German translation is a sound one. Now, what did he use? Well, there are usually pretty overplayed stories about Luther going line by line and rendering it straight over in perfect German. Well, I've said before, and I'm stressing again here, honestly, the average seminarian who's gone through Greek probably knows a good bit more Greek than even Luther would at this point. Luther, like anybody, used help in his translation. The text Luther used was actually Erasmus's Greek New Testament. Now, if you understand this book, you'll understand what Luther is doing when he's using it. Erasmus, when he published the Greek New Testament in 1516, actually didn't do so in an effort to really sort of spur on or inspire necessarily the study of Koine Greek. Erasmus actually got into this project first and foremost because he wanted to correct and improve the Vulgate. Now, the Vulgate is the translation of Jerome in the 5th century into Latin, where Jerome had used the Greek and Hebrew text and translated it over. Well, Erasmus, in reading the Vulgate, found it actually not the best Latin. Erasmus was simply that good at Ciceronian Latin. Erasmus actually has a relatively bad joke in which he says that part of his intention was to make sure that the Apostle Paul addresses the Romans in better Latin than Jerome had made him address the Romans. So Erasmus's impulse here, again, is not to spawn a wave of Greek New Testament studies, but rather to fix the Latin Vulgate. Well, the way that he gets to this, in part, is through the Greek text. He's an omnivore when it comes to languages, particularly ancient languages. And so what Erasmus does in 1516 is he compiles roughly, loosely, and frankly quickly, as many of the Greek texts that he can find. Now, the only texts he can find are 12th century Byzantine texts. These are not the ancient texts or the oldest texts that we have. Not only that, but the first edition of Erasmus' Greek New Testament contained a number of typographical errors. Erasmus himself admits that he compiled the book in a rather slapdash manner. And textual critics of the New Testament will tell us that Erasmus's text is really not necessarily the best. Now, this is somewhat ironic because these texts that Erasmus uses come to be known later as the Textus Receptus, or the received text. And it's these texts that, of course, become the basis of the King James Version, because it does take some time for us to develop an awareness of so many of the variety of manuscripts. And of course, the Textus Receptus in the KJV become the bedrock of the idea of the KJV only folks. Well, the manuscripts that Erasmus uses are 12th century Byzantine texts. In fact, interestingly enough, he doesn't even have the first 6 verses of the book of Revelation in the Textus Receptus, in the document that Erasmus uses. He actually has to take the Latin Vulgate and translate the first 6 verses of Revelation from the Latin into the Greek because he doesn't simply have them in the manuscripts that he had acquired. He also corrects a number of things along the way to better suit his liking. The important thing, though, is Erasmus's Greek New Testament, as it's called, wasn't actually a Greek New Testament. Now, it certainly had the Greek New Testament in it, but when we actually go and look at the book, it's actually something like an interlinear. If you open to any page, on the left-hand side is the Greek of whatever chapter or verse you're looking at, and on the right-hand side of the page is a new, better Latin translation that Erasmus has written, both in part to correct the Vulgate, as well as to base that Latin translation more closely or more faithfully on the Greek. So in other words, Luther at the Wartburg, using the Erasmian New Testament, is essentially given a real strong leg up in terms of being able to understand where the Greek to Latin translation points are. In other words, Luther knew his Vulgate. He had used the Jerome Bible as every man had done in the Middle Ages. Only Erasmus now gave them a way of triangulating, you might say, between the Greek, which Luther knew a little bit of, and Erasmus's new translation, and the Vulgate itself. If you notice a discrepancy, you can look up the Greek words and figure out what the issue is. This, in other words, is enormously helpful and something like training wheels, you might say, for Luther as he translates into German. He's not sitting there, as I've said, just with the Greek, sort of with the power of his brain, simply translating it all in full on his own. Well, Luther isn't only worried about the translation of the Bible. While at the Wartburg, Luther also sends out a number of texts that sort of become programmatic or sloganeering documents, you might say, of where Luther intends the Reformation to take the church. One of the more famous ones is called On Confession. And in this one, Luther is actually taking on the idea that you have to confess to a priest, which was, of course, part of the penitential sacramental order of the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. In that document, Luther says, actually, that every Christian is a confessor, which is, frankly, as close as Luther's ever going to get to saying anything like the priesthood of all believers. No one in the 16th century ever said the phrase priesthood of all believers, by the way. But the doctrine behind this thing called the priesthood of all believers is what Luther has said here in this book on confession. You see, the priesthood of all believers has actually nothing per se to do with ordination. The priesthood of all believers is not a claim that priesthood or pastoring or ordination is now irrelevant, or that we're all somehow our own little popes that interpret the scriptures or come up with our own meaning, all these kinds of things. Rather, what Luther says here is that this idea of being a confessor to one another, again, what we would call the priesthood of all believers, is that we don't have to go to a priest or a pastor to confess. That as 1 Peter says, we are a holy priesthood, a chosen nation, we the church. And so therefore, if my brother or my sister comes to me and they confess their sins, or if I go to them, as the body of Christ, we can lift one another up. We can, in a medieval way of talking about it, hear one another's confessions. Because that confession is no longer tied to penance and works and merit, but rather repentance and the life of the Christian in the context of the church. Luther also sends a letter, an open letter that was published, that went around to monasteries and nunneries, letting them know that now that the Pope has been exposed, and now that the Catholic Church has sort of shown its stripes, that those who were unwilling participants in the monastic order, those who had qualms about this, could now be freed, can be considered freed of their monastic vows. Now, he doesn't tell all of them they have to come out, but rather he says, if you desire to come out, you don't have to keep this vow anymore. This is no longer the best life for the Christian. All life is sacred, all callings are sacred. You do not have to stay in the monastery working out your salvation. Now, by and large, a significant number of monastics came out of the monasteries in Germany. It would seem, in fact, that Luther, after the Diet of Worms, has simply become a lightning rod for all discontented Catholics who desire for a different expression of their Christian faith. Now, not everyone saw Luther as the apostle of the Reformation, even in Germany. And what arose while Luther was in the Wartburg were a couple of impulses in Germany that really convulsed the Reformation and put it on rocky soil from really the very beginning. And that is, there were a number of folks who felt that Luther wasn't radical enough. Or at least over time, they come to the conclusion that Luther isn't radical enough. There are also a number of people who are not content merely to reform the church and reform ministry and reform Christian life, but they also want to inject a great deal of apocalypticism into their understanding of Protestantism. Now, historians have spent a lot of time trying to piece these folks together to understand their teachings. The problem with really understanding all these groups is twofold. One, in the past, historians tended to kind of paint everyone as the same brush, either Anabaptists in general or as part of the radical Reformation overall. And what that tends to do is it gives us tunnel vision, and we think that everyone kind of fits into this one category, even though a variety of people might be quite different. The other thing is at times we don't necessarily always know what they were teaching, saying, or doing, or even what their impulse might have been whenever they went into rebellion. Well, in the case of Luther, in Wittenberg, of course, there was Luther's good friend Andreas Karlstadt. Well, at some point during the course of the Reformation, some sort of screw went loose in Karlstadt's brain, at least according to Luther. You see, Karlstadt really became disenfranchised with the order of the church as a result of the Reformation. That is to say, in 21st century language, he got burnt out on organized religion. And Karlstadt actually meets up with a man who comes to Wittenberg by the name of Gabriel Zwilling. And Zwilling is one of these apocalyptic type folks. He wants to radicalize the Reformation. And Karlstadt buys into this. And what they begin to preach and teach in the city of Wittenberg, now with Luther gone, is that there needs to be more radical measures taken to cast down the old structures of Catholicism. And one of the big ones that they undertook was something called iconoclasm, which is you go into churches and you break statues, you destroy art, you destroy anything that would be considered idolatrous. Now, this is important because this happens in January of 1522. And when Luther hears about this, he goes crazy. He loses his mind out of frustration and anger. He actually writes a letter in which he says that Satan has entered my sheepfold. And it's this problem of the apocalypticism of Zwilling and Andreas Karlstadt that brings Luther once and for all out of the Wartburg into Wittenberg. And in March of that year, Luther returns to the city. Luther preaches a series of sermons in which he affirms his relative doctrinal affiliation and similarity with Karlstadt. He affirms him somewhat, but then he says that the Reformation in his city won't go like they're doing it, that they will not be radical here. Now, Andreas Karlstadt and Zwilling repent a little bit. Zwilling in particular repents entirely and kind of caves under, knuckles under to the Lutheran Reformation. Karlstadt repents a little bit, but he still seems to be a bit bent out of shape by this. Reports about Karlstadt are that he walked around in peasant's clothes. He liked people to call him Brother Andreas. Didn't want to go by Dr. Karlstadt or anything else. And he sort of acts a bit kooky. And eventually, he gets a call to a pastorate in Orlamunda. And it's very compelling and very interesting because he goes to this city and he becomes a pastor and he begins to enact a number of what we'd call radical reforms in the city. The congregation that he sets up, the church that he governs, might very well be called congregational or, in modern lingo, non-denominational. He also begins to challenge the idea of infant baptism. More radically, he says that the church should have no music and no art, because those things are obviously of the devil. And again, he begins to radicalize. After a couple years, in 1524, Luther actually begins to attack Karlstadt, his old buddy, his old partner and colleague, and he argues that Karlstadt should not be allowed to publish or preach without Luther's express consent, a comment by Luther which actually requires eventually that Karlstadt resign his post. Now, if that's not enough for Luther in Wittenberg, there's one more really serious uprising in Germany that puts the Reformation on the horns of a dilemma, and that is the actions of Thomas Müntzer in the German Peasant Revolt. Müntzer was another one of these apocalyptic guys. In fact, he was familiar with some of the other folks that had come to Wittenberg before. Well, through his teachings and through a number of others, there arose in 1525 a massive uprising of peasants all throughout the country and down into the Swiss regions. Now, these were peasants, they were the low classes. They had no military prowess or any arms that they could marshal or equip themselves with to really do any serious battle. And even if they did have these things, they didn't really know how to use them very well. They weren't trained. Well, these peasants went to war in part because they believed that there needed to be a radical revolution in society, not just in the church. They wanted the overthrow of the entire order of what was left over from the feudal era, and they believed they wanted everything held in common, meaning a certain form of socialism. Luther, over the course of these uprisings, wrote a number of tracts, but by far the most inflammatory was one that Luther entitled Against the Murdering, Thieving Hordes of Peasants. And this is really where you see Luther not at his best. In fact, it's really quite heinous what he says here. He actually argues that anyone who finds these peasants who are uprising should just sort of feel free to kill them. And he argues that nothing can be more poisonous, hurtful, or satanic than a rebel. Now, in later lectures, we're going to have a lot to say about Luther and politics in the two kingdoms. But here is an application of Luther's early view, which is that Protestants don't rebel, that being violent means that you should be killed as quickly as possible, and that very likely you are going straight to hell for having rebelled. Okay, moving on and setting aside the issue of Luther and rebellion and his comments about the Peasants' War, we can say two more things about the shaping of Luther's Reformation here in the middle point of the 1520s that are vital to understand in terms of Luther's impact culturally and theologically. The first is Luther's marriage. As we said in previous lectures about the medieval background, it was scandalous to believe that a pastor or a priest could be a married man. They were to be holy, and in this day and age, prior to Luther, holiness was in part due to the person's willingness to cut themselves off from the things of this world. And one of the big ones that you would cut yourself off from was the right to marry. Well, it goes without saying that Luther, now the reformer, 4 years on from the Diet of Worms, for him to marry is one of the most dramatic cultural and sociological and frankly even theological changes that Luther can bring to the post-Reformation world. Most Protestants and evangelicals today actually have a bit of the opposite of what it was experienced in the Middle Ages. Most of us are unable to think of pastors who are not married. Well, it would be only slightly hyperbolic to say that Luther symbolically broke through this wall and married, and that everything that flows after that, all of the Protestant discussion of married pastors in the family life, is based, at least in part, if not significantly, on Luther's willingness to take this step. Luther, even in his own self-identification as the man who began the Reformation, knew that marriage was something that he should do in order to symbolize his break with the past. Well, the woman he married was Katie von Bora, or Katharina von Bora, or Catherine von Bora, depends on how modern English speakers render the name. Luther referred to her personally as my Katie, so I've chosen to call her Katie von Bora. Well, on June 13, 1525, Luther married her, and Katie was actually a former nun. She had been a nun in a German monastery, and she had been snuck out through these fish barrels as a result of Luther's proclamation and evisceration of the order of the monasteries. And having nowhere else to go, Katie and a number of other nuns who left the monastery arrived in Wittenberg. Now, Katie has gone down in history as one of the great women of the Reformation, if not of church history. She was plucky, she was spunky, she was smart. She had all of these amazing qualities and attributes to her. In fact, one of the great chagrins of most historians is that we don't really know a great deal about her from either her own words or really more than what Luther tells us about her. But it is telling, I think, of Luther's personality that so highly did he speak of his wife in just about any context, private letters offhand comments and even formal things that he said about her in his writings, Luther always spoke enormously highly of her. In fact, to this day, in the typical Lutheran calendar, there is a feast celebrating Katie von Bora on December 20th every year. Well, by and large, Luther and Katie had an extraordinarily complex and interesting, and I hasten to use the word, wonderful marriage. They had 6 children together, and they adopted 4 orphans. There are often scenes depicting in art Luther playing music and his children and his wife sitting around them. One of the more poignant moments for Luther actually was that he actually lost one of his children at a very young age, young Elizabeth, by some sort of disease or something that she had acquired. Very common for this day for people to die young. And the scene and the description Luther gives of having his heart torn out because his daughter has passed away is one of the more poignant and humanizing ways that we can gain a little bit of access into the real man who Martin Luther was. And even just the fact that they had children was, again, enormously controversial for the day. As Heiko Obermann has pointed out, actually, it was a common sort of urban legend that the Antichrist would be born by a former monk and a former nun, 2 renegades, conceiving a child and giving birth, that was going to be the Antichrist. And Obermann tells this wonderful story about how when their first child was born, even committed Protestants were asking, is the baby looking good? Is the baby healthy? Did it come out with horns on its head? These kinds of things. But Luther had 6 children of his own and 4 adopted. Another thing that was dramatically important in shaping Luther's voice and his theological vision for the Protestant church also occurred in 1525, in December. And that was Luther's debate with Erasmus in writing on the subject of free will. Now, I want to bring this up because it's actually quite striking because in terms of modern popular misconceptions of the doctrine of predestination or free will, you still find a number of people who believe that this doctrine is somehow the intellectual property of Calvinists or Reformed people. You can actually find all kinds of places where people refer to the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. Now, that's telling that we have a massive miscommunication on our hands because, in fact, here we have Luther in 1525 writing on this subject years before Calvin even converts to the faith. Now, as we'll say when we get later in the course to the comparing and contrasting phase, we'll actually look at Calvin and Luther on the doctrine of predestination. And we will say there, and I'm going to go ahead and give you the punchline, they do have a different perspective on this and a different application of the doctrine of predestination. But it mostly has to do with when we discuss it and how it is preached and at what point the doctrine of predestination is raised in the Christian life. Luther, over time, is actually quite demure at when we should talk about it, because he will say the main issue is preach the gospel. And whenever someone says, oh, I believe the gospel, you say, well, congratulations, God has seen fit to illuminate your mind and save your soul. Luther will not, in other words, talk about predestination in a more systematic theology sense or in a more abstract sense. Not that Calvin or anyone else would really talk about it abstractly. But for Luther, predestination is a after-the-fact discussion whenever someone has come to believe the gospel, and it is not something that is to be incorporated heavily into the Christian life. Well, here in 1525, Luther gets into a battle of wills, a theological sparring match, with one of the great eminent lights of the Reformation period, Erasmus. Well, a number of people in Luther's day blamed, in at least a simple way, Erasmus for what happened in the Reformation. It was believed that Erasmus had been too snarky, or that some of the texts that he had put out, for example, the Greek New Testament, and the retranslation of the Bible into a better Latin, had eroded the confidence of reformers for the Catholic Church. And for most of the Reformation, Erasmus stays quiet. He actually doesn't get involved openly with anything. That is, of course, until 1524, when Erasmus writes a book called On Free Will. And in it, Erasmus, in his own style and in his own way, essentially toes the medieval line in terms of his understanding of how our will is involved in the process of the Christian life. Now, hopefully you can recall our discussion on the will when we looked at Luther in the monastery and Luther in his engagement with scholasticism. Erasmus essentially takes the argument of the latter Middle Ages, which says, we have free will, God has foreknown what we will do, but in terms of grace, grace comes to give us strength, but it doesn't create in us out of nothing, faith itself, and then therefore our works are, Erasmus will say, again, very typically for this day and age in the Catholic Church, our works are something that we ought to perform. We can perform them. We have the ability. So that's Erasmus's argument, essentially, in 1524. Well, in December of 1525, Luther comes out swinging on this issue. In fact, anyone who reads The Bondage of the Will is usually struck by the forcefulness that Luther argues his case. Well, what is Luther's argument? Well, we've already seen that Luther is negative. He's pessimistic. He's very, very unwilling to discuss the ability of our will to perform good works in keeping with our salvation. But let's do just a quick synopsis of this in terms of systematic theology. In the Reformation, the discussion of the freedom of the will in this case, and the subject of predestination, as it's called, is not first and foremost a discussion of whether or not God has allowed something like, let's say, 9/11 to occur. In traditional categories, in traditional discussions, the subject of whether or not God causes all things to come to pass, things that are tragedies, for example, is not discussed under the heading of predestination. Rather, that subject is handled under a different name, theodicy, which in more popular language we say is the problem of evil. How can a good God allow all things to come to pass? In this case, in the Reformation, the discussion of the freedom or the bondage of the will, and by extension predestination, is a discussion on our ability prior to conversion and our will's ability to perform good works on their own power and strength. In other words, I always tell students, it's a question of who moves first, God or us. And again, that's overly simplistic, but it puts the situation in more of a stark contrast, which is where Erasmus and Luther take it. Erasmus essentially says, we move first, we are able to act, and God cooperates with us, or more accurately, we cooperate with God in terms of the grace that he allows us to have. Well, not surprisingly, given all the backstory that we've told thus far, Luther finds this abhorrent. He does not believe, at this point, and all the way back to his Reformation breakthrough, that our wills have the ability to do anything apart from grace. Our wills, in other words, are dead in their trespasses. And, to put it bluntly, dead men don't make choices. For Luther, the dead will must be resurrected, and that it must be carried along by God. And therefore, he'll say, since our will was dead, it was in bondage, it was unable to choose God ultimately or in any real capacity, then all that comes after salvation can be said to be given a gift of the Holy Spirit. Now, he doesn't mean that we're robots. Rather, I tell people it's a bit like the way we understand that we have the gift of life. In fact, that's probably the best analogy entirely. Just as we were given the gift of life, just as God gave us our lives, he gave us our souls, he gave us our bodies, he gave us life. And yet we speak so effortlessly that it's our life. We don't feel that somehow, simply because life was a gift to us, that we are simply robots, and that if life is given to me, well, then it's not my life. I have to somehow own it myself. This is really more where Luther's coming from. He's saying our wills were regenerated. Now, that word actually, in the original etymology of it, means that it was resurrected. There was a Genesis moment where our dead wills were given life. And the Spirit is therefore equipping and nurturing and sanctifying us all along the way. And Luther will say, prior to that, our wills are in bondage. They are unable on their own to free themselves. They always choose narcissistically sinful behaviors. Now, not utterly so. Luther's not saying we're all little baby Hitlers running around. But what he's saying is that when it comes to choosing God, left to our own devices, our wills are dead and unable to choose him. Now, one thing to say before we conclude this, some allege, particularly those who are in later Lutheran circles, that Luther really didn't mean this book, that it wasn't his best work. He wrote it out early, and it was entirely in response to Erasmus, and therefore he can kind of be forgiven for this. A lot of the impulse for this is that later, as Lutheran and Calvinist circles begin to fight with one another, one of the touchstones of where they fight is on the subject of the ongoing evolution of some of the language in the Reformed world about predestination, and a relative pullback in the Lutheran circles in their willingness to discuss this doctrine in full. at least outside of the context of post-regeneration, post-justification. And so over time, people began to allege that Luther didn't really mean what he said here. Actually, all the way till the day he died, he actually refers to this as his most important and his best book. In 1537, not long before his death, when he looks back on all of his writings, he actually at that time refers to this book as his best book. But you have to understand why Luther would say that and what he means. For Luther, the freedom of the will is synonymous with medieval monastic virtues and sanctification and penance. So of course he's going to say that a book that challenges that and he thinks destroys the doctrine of the freedom of the will is his best book because it clarifies that his Reformation breakthrough means that God saves us and that we contributed nothing to our salvation. Okay, that's it. Next, we're going to look at some of the political problems of Lutheranism in the 1520s, how it very nearly crashed and burned, and then we're going to look at Luther and Zwingli and their good fight at the colloquy of Marburg.